Welcome to this deep dive, where we take complex topics and try to extract the most insightful nuggets for you. Today, we're venturing into a realm that's fascinated people for ages. The potential for human perception beyond our normal senses, what's often called extrasensory perception, or ESP.
Right. And for a long time, these kinds of experiences, that strong gut feeling or sensing something about someone far off, they were often just dismissed, weren't they?
Totally. Coincidence, imagination, not really seen as, well, scientific.
But that's what's shifting now, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're seeing fields like neuroscience and maybe even quantum physics starting to look seriously at whether there's a biological basis for all this.
Exactly, using rigorous methods. So our goal today, our mission for this deep dive, is to really explore what this research is uncovering about extrasensory communication.
We'll look at the brain, potential mechanisms.
Yeah, and even touch on how these capacities might perhaps be developed.
Though it's crucial right from the outset to keep a balanced perspective.
Absolutely.
We're exploring possibilities, looking at the science with an open mind, but definitely a critical one too.
Critical thinking is key. And, to really get where this is going, it helps to remember this isn't some brand new idea.
Oh, not at all.
Ancient traditions worldwide often viewed these abilities as, well, natural human potentials. Think ancient Egypt, Chinese Taoism.
Indian yoga, indigenous shamanic practices.
Yeah.
A lot of cultures saw these not as supernatural necessarily.
Right, more like inherent capacities, things you could strengthen.
Exactly. Through training, specific ways of living, it wasn't magic, it was potential.
Then fast forward, late 19th century, you get groups like the Society for Psychical Research starting systematic inquiry. And then early 20th century, J.B. Rhine at Duke University really brings in controlled experiments. That kind of established parapsychology as an academic thing.
Albeit a controversial one.
Sure.
But yeah, Ryan's work was foundational for experimental approaches.
And now with brain imaging, MRI, EEG, all that tech.
Well, that's pushing the field forward again. Researchers are literally looking inside the brain during these tasks, these reported experiences.
What are they finding? Is it clear-cut?
Not exactly clear-cut, no. The results vary. There's still a ton we don't know. But we are seeing some fascinating patterns, some clues.
Okay, but you mentioned challenges. Reproducibility seems like a big hurdle here.
It really is.
Yeah.
Getting the same results consistently across different labs, different studies, that's the gold standard in science, and it's been particularly tough in ESP research.
Why is that, do you think?
Well, partly it could be the subtlety of the effects themselves, and then there's the potential for bias.
Right, because it's so controversial, researchers' own beliefs might unconsciously sway things.
Precisely. Which is why things like double-blind protocols are absolutely essential. You need rigorous design to minimize that.
And I guess another core challenge is just, how does this even work? We lack those clear mechanisms that fit neatly into current science.
That's a huge point. Even when a study shows a correlation, like brain activity linking up with some ESP task, explaining how that happens biologically or physically, that's still the big question mark.
Gotcha. Okay, so despite the challenges, what methods are researchers actually using? You mentioned card guessing.
Yeah, the classic Zener cards, trying to guess symbols, that's one. Then there's remote viewing.
Right, trying to describe a distant, unseen place or object.
Exactly. People try to describe it, and then their descriptions are judged, usually blind, against the actual target in decoys.
Okay, what else?
There are studies looking at physiological synchrony.
Like heart rates or brain waves syncing up between people.
Even when they're separated. Measuring if bodily responses somehow coordinate,
Yeah.
and also intention influence experiments.
That's testing if thoughts can affect, say, another person's body or even random machines.
Correct, like random number generators. Can focused intention alter their output beyond chance? These are some of the main approaches.
Okay, quite a range. So with that background, let's really dig into the brain itself. What's neuroscience telling us about potential links to these experiences?
Well, what's really interesting is there doesn't seem to be one single ESP spot in the brain.
No magic antenna.
Exactly. But researchers have identified certain brain regions and networks that consistently seem more active or involved when people are engaged in these kinds of tasks.
Okay, like what?
One pattern that keeps emerging is something called right hemisphere dominance.
So more activity on the right side of the brain.
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
Especially in a specific area called the right temporoparietal junction, or TPJ for short.
The TPJ, okay, let's unpack that. Why is that area significant?
The right TPJ is really involved in distinguishing ourselves from others, self-other boundaries, perspective taking, It helps us understand we're separate individuals, but also see things from someone else's point of view.
Ah, okay. So the theory is maybe increased activity there means those boundaries are blurring slightly.
That's the hypothesis. If you're having an experience that feels like it extends beyond your personal self, maybe connecting with another mind, perhaps that's reflected in changes within the TPJ, a sort of loosening of that rigid self-other distinction.
Interesting. What about the default mode network, the DMN? We hear about that with mind wandering.
Right, the DMN is typically active when we're not focused on the outside world, when we're introspecting, thinking about ourselves or the past or future.
So how does it fit with ESP?
Well, studies have found different patterns of DMN activity during ESP tasks compared to just normal daydreaming. It's not just on or off.
Different activation patterns.
Yeah, and what's really intriguing is that some of these patterns look quite similar to those seen in very experienced long-term meditators.
Ah, that's a fascinating link. So maybe that deep internal focus, quieting the external chatter, creates a brain state more receptive to subtle information.
That's a strong possibility. It suggests a certain kind of internal, quiet, or altered network dynamics might allow for processing information that usually gets filtered out.
Okay. Then you mentioned prefrontal integration, involving areas like the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC, and orbitofrontal regions. What are they integrating?
So these prefrontal areas are like the brain's executive suite. The ACC helps with attention, error detection, conflict monitoring,
Right.
and the orbitofrontal cortex is involved in decision-making, evaluating information, especially emotional information. In an ESP context, their role might be to pick up on very weak signals.
Signals that don't come through the usual senses.
Potentially, signals that are maybe below the threshold of normal conscious awareness. These regions might be integrating these faint inputs, contributing to that feeling of intuition or a gut knowing.
Makes sense. What about the mirror neuron system? We know it's involved in empathy and imitation.
Exactly. Mirror neurons fire both when we do something and when we see someone else do it. It's fundamental for understanding actions, intentions, feeling empathy.
So how does that link to telepathy, maybe?
The idea is this neural resonance, this mirroring, might happen on a more subtle level. Perhaps it's not just about observed actions, but could extend to internal states, like emotions or even thoughts, especially between people with strong connections. A kind of deeper empathy, maybe.
Wow, okay. A neural basis for feeling what someone else feels, potentially even at a distance.
It's a hypothesis being explored. And finally, you mentioned the cerebellum. We usually think of coordination, movement.
Right, balance and motor skills.
Definitely crucial for that. But the cerebellum is also deeply involved in timing, in processing temporal information, and in prediction, anticipating what's coming next based on past patterns.
So how could that relate to something like precognition, seeing the future?
Some researchers speculate that this predictive function, this ability to model time and anticipate outcomes, might somehow, under certain conditions, tap into information that hasn't strictly happened yet in our linear perception of time.
Like the brain simulation running slightly ahead, maybe picking up on future data points somehow.
That's one way to think about it. Yes,
Yeah.
it's speculative, but it connects the cerebellum's known functions to these unusual experiences.
Okay, so we've got these potential brain regions and networks involved, but can the brain itself change to enhance these abilities? Let's talk neuroplasticity.
Absolutely crucial concept here. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, form new connections based on experience, is fundamental. If these abilities are latent potentials, then plasticity is the mechanism through which they could actually be developed or strengthened.
And we see direct evidence of this with long-term meditators, right? You mentioned structural changes.
Yes, research consistently shows differences. Things like thicker gray matter in areas like the ACC and the insula key for attention, self-awareness, emotional regulation.
Thicker cortex, wow.
And also enhanced white matter pathways. These are the communication cables between brain regions. Stronger connections mean more efficient information flow.
Better wiring.
Better wiring, exactly. And often better functional connectivity, especially between networks like the DMN and attention networks. It's like they learn to work together more harmoniously.
You called this super integration. What does that mean for ESP potential?
Well, a brain that's more integrated, with better communication between regions, might be more sensitive. It might be better at detecting those very subtle signals we talked about, signals that a less integrated, maybe noisier brain would just filter out.
So training the brain through practices like meditation could literally make it a better receiver for this kind of information.
That's the potential, yes. fine-tuning the instrument, so to speak.
Okay, that's fascinating. Now let's shift gears a bit into territory that some might find, well, more out there. The quantum biology perspective.
Right, this is definitely more theoretical, but it's gaining traction as a way to potentially frame these phenomena without breaking known physics. The weirdness of quantum mechanics, things like entanglement, non-locality.
Entanglement being particles linked instantly over distance, non-locality meaning effects aren't tied to one place.
Exactly. And some scientists are asking, could these quantum effects actually be playing a role inside the brain, in biological systems?
Okay, you mentioned a specific theory. Microtubule quantum computing. That sounds intense.
It is. It's a theory from Sir Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. They propose that microtubules, which are part of the structure inside neurons, might act as sites for quantum computation.
Quantum processing inside brain cells.
That's the idea. That quantum states within these tiny structures could be linked to moments of conscious awareness through a process they call orchestrated objective reduction. It's complex, but if true, it opens the door to quantum effects, like entanglement being part of how consciousness works.
Which could potentially explain connections that seem to defy classical space and time.
Potentially, yes. Another idea is biophoton communication. What's that about?
Biophotons are extremely weak light particles emitted by all living cells, usually considered just a metabolic byproduct. But this idea suggests they might actually form a coherent field, a kind of light-based communication network within the body, and maybe even between individuals. A quantum information network using light.
That's the speculative proposal, transmitting information in ways we don't currently understand via conventional biology.
And the third quantum idea, non-local consciousness.
This tackles the issue head-on. It suggests consciousness itself might not be entirely confined to the physical brain, that it might have fundamental quantum properties allowing it to operate, interact, or access information non-locally beyond the usual limits of space.
So consciousness isn't just in the brain, but maybe interacts through it.
That's one way to frame it. Again, these are frontier ideas. They're speculative.
Very important to stress that.
Absolutely. But they offer potential frameworks, ways to think about phenomena like ESP that seem non-local without necessarily throwing out all of physics. They suggest maybe physics works in biology in ways we haven't fully appreciated yet.
Okay, providing alternative lenses. Let's bring it back to specific abilities now. Telepathy, thought, or emotion transfer. You mentioned neural oscillation synchrony, brain waves syncing up.
Yes, exactly. Brainwaves are rhythmic electrical patterns. Research, particularly by people like Dean Radin and others, has shown instances where brainwave patterns of emotionally close individuals, twins, couples seem to synchronize, become more similar even when they're physically separated and shielded.
So their brains are literally getting on the same wavelength.
In a measurable way, sometimes.
Yeah.
It suggests a potential mechanism for a shared information field, a subtle connection.
Fascinating. What about social brain networks? How do our normal social processing circuits fit in?
Our brains are exquisitely tuned to social cues, microexpressions, tone of voice, intention. The idea here is maybe these networks are so sensitive they can pick up on incredibly subtle signals, things below conscious awareness, that still convey information about another person's internal state.
So like hypersensitive social perception bleeding into what feels like telepathy.
Possibly. It's pushing the boundary of known mechanisms. And then there's the somatic mirror system.
We talked mirror neurons, but what's somatic mean here?
Somatic refers to the body. So this system is about how we internally represent and resonate with the bodily feelings of others, feeling their tension, their ease.
Ah, like empathy, but on a physical level.
Exactly. And the idea is maybe this extends beyond just seeing someone. Especially in strong emotional situations, maybe we can subtly feel another's physiological state, even at a distance. That strong synchrony seen between mothers and infants is a prime example of this deep bio-emotional connection.
Right, that intense bond. Okay, let's shift to precognition, knowing the future. This one really bends our minds.
It does. But neuroscience reminds us our experience of time is a brain construct. It's not absolute.
Okay, so if time perception is flexible, what brain stuff might be involved in feeling like you know what's coming? Predictive coding networks.
Right. Our brain is constantly predicting the immediate future based on past data and current sensory input. It's trying to anticipate what happens next to process the world efficiently.
Standard brain function.
Yes. The precognition hypothesis suggests that maybe sometimes these predictive networks integrate information that isn't from the past or present senses. Maybe they tap into some other source about the future, making an unusually accurate prediction.
A prediction that feels like knowledge.
Exactly. Then there are time perception anomalies.
How we subjectively experience time changing.
Yeah. Brain areas like the basal ganglia and prefrontal cortex manage our sense of time flow. If their function shifts, maybe in altered states, our subjective experience of past, present, and future could become less distinct, more blurred.
Leading to feelings of knowing something before it happens because your now is stretched or shifted.
Potentially. And related to that is the idea of blurred boundaries between memory and expectation.
How memory and thinking about the future might get mixed up.
The brain networks for remembering the past and imagining the future overlap significantly. It's possible that cross-activation could occur, making a future possibility feel like a memory, giving it that sense of certainty.
Feels familiar, like it already happened.
Something like that. And finally, those presentiment effects. Physiological responses before a random event.
Yeah, you mentioned this earlier, the body reacting before the stimulus.
It's a controversial finding from some labs, yes. Studies where physiological measures like skin conductance seem to change before a randomly selected emotional picture is shown, compared to a neutral one.
As if the nervous system is anticipating the emotional hit.
That's the interpretation. It suggests some level of subconscious processing of future events, at least under specific experimental conditions. Needs much more research, obviously.
Definitely intriguing. Okay, last specific ability. Remote viewing, describing unseen places. What's the brain doing?
Consistently, studies show activation in the visual cortex.
Even with eyes closed, no visual input.
Correct. It's as if the brain is internally generating the visual experience of the target scene.
Like using the mind's eye, quite literally.
Pretty much. Also, increased activity in internal attention networks.
Focusing inward, like visualization or memory recall.
Exactly. It seems that deep inward focus helps access the subtle impressions associated with the remote target.
And you also mentioned multisensory integration areas being active. Why those?
In areas like the TPJ again, and the posterior cingulate cortex, these regions normally blend input from different senses to create our coherent worldview.
So in remote viewing, maybe they're integrating fragments, weak signals.
That's the idea, taking maybe partial visual impressions, feelings, conceptual data, these subtle non-sensory inputs, and trying to weave them into a meaningful perception of the target.
Which might explain why remote viewers often talk about that signal versus noise problem, trying to sort perception from imagination.
Precisely. It reflects the brain working hard to interpret ambiguous, weak information that isn't coming through the usual clear sensory channels.
Okay, so it seems like the brain is trying its best to process whatever information it gets, conventional or otherwise. This leads to the big question. Can we actually get better at this? Can we train these abilities? You mentioned neuroplasticity-guided training.
Yes, the core idea is leveraging the brain's plasticity. If these networks can be identified, maybe they can be strengthened through targeted practice.
Like what kind of practice? Attention training through meditation?
Definitely. Meditation, especially mindfulness, enhances prefrontal control, helps filter noise, increases sensitivity to subtle internal states. This can make it easier to notice weak external signals, too.
Sharpening the focus. What about perception threshold lowering?
This is about consciously trying to notice fainter sensory inputs in daily life. The quietest sound, the slightest texture change. Training your awareness to pick up on things usually below conscious level.
Becoming more sensitive overall?
Potentially, yes. Then neural integration exercises.
Activities that link up different brain areas.
Right, things that force different regions to work together. Multisensory tasks, maybe certain types of creative work, complex coordination exercises, anything promoting holistic brain function.
And physiological feedback linkage, using biofeedback. How does knowing your own heart rate help?
Biofeedback makes you aware of your own subtle physiological shifts. Becoming attuned to your own inner state might increase sensitivity to the subtle physiological states of others, a sort of resonance.
Tuning into yourself to better tune into others, makes sense. And default mode network regulation, learning to shift brain states.
Yes, using meditation or other techniques to consciously move into those quieter, internally focused states, maybe even temporarily modulating DMN activity, could create a more receptive condition for this kind of information.
Okay, you break down some practical methods too, basic level, image transmission practice.
Classic telepathy exercise. Sender focuses on an image, receiver tries to get it. Start simple, build complexity, builds focus and receptivity.
Emotion synchronization practice.
Similar, but with feelings. One person generates an emotion, the other tries to tune in and identify it. Taps into emotional circuitry.
And tactile guided meditation.
Using touch focus in meditation to enhance bodily awareness, then maybe expanding that awareness beyond the physical body boundary.
Okay, intermediate level. Remote viewing training. More structured now.
Yes, using standardized protocols, often with double-blind judging to assess accuracy objectively. Learning specific techniques.
Perspective perception practice. Working on that presentiment feeling.
Right. Starting with controlled guessing games with feedback, then trying to apply it to real-world situations, like predicting phone calls or visitors without immediate confirmation.
And dream ESP cultivation. Using lucid dreaming.
Yeah, leveraging the dream state. Becoming lucid aware you're dreaming and then setting an intention within the dream to receive specific information. Some find dreams fertile ground for this.
Fascinating. Advanced stage. Group consciousness field experiments.
Exploring collective effects. Group meditation focused on a shared intention or target. Does the group field enhance individual abilities or produce collective phenomena?
Alternate consciousness state exploration.
Using techniques like holotropic breathwork, sound-induced states, guided journeys carefully exploring non-ordinary states where these experiences might be more accessible.
And finally, integration and application practice.
Taking any developed skills and consciously applying them to real-life challenges, problem-solving, creativity, decision-making, and systematically tracking the results, making it practical.
Okay. You also mentioned things that help or hinder these abilities. Relaxed states seem good.
Generally, yes. Meditative states, alpha-theta brainwaves, right brain thinking, emotional connection, hypnagogic sleep onset states, and an open, non-judgmental attitude all seem conducive.
And what gets in the way?
Stress, fear, anxiety are big blockers. Too much analytical thinking, trying too hard, self-doubt, skepticism, basically internal noise.
External noise too.
Environmental noise, maybe even electromagnetic noise could interfere. And while some drugs alter perception, they often disrupt the clarity needed. An exception might be during emergencies, where abilities sometimes spike unexpectedly despite fear.
Interesting exception. So it's about cultivating the right internal conditions. Looking ahead now, where does all this lead? Rethinking consciousness itself.
It really forces us to. If these phenomena are real, our standard brain equals consciousness model might be incomplete. We see ideas like extended consciousness, consciousness interacting beyond the brain.
Quantum consciousness theories we discussed.
Right. Information field theories, maybe consciousness taps into a universal data field, dual aspect integration trying to bridge subjective experience and objective physics, all attempts to make sense of the data within science.
And it's becoming very interdisciplinary.
Hugely. Neuroscience and quantum physics collaborating. AI helping analyze complex data for subtle patterns. Social neuroscience looking at group synchrony. Even cultural anthropology comparing cross-cultural reports. Bringing different fields together offers the best chance for breakthroughs.
What about potential applications down the line, if this develops further?
The possibilities are pretty vast. Enhanced medical intuition, maybe earlier diagnosis, better crisis prediction, new avenues for creative problem solving, deeper interpersonal empathy and communication, maybe even consciousness-based technologies we can't yet imagine.
But there are ethical considerations too, surely.
Absolutely critical. Privacy issues, mind reading, information verification, how do you know it's accurate, potential for misuse, the need to balance open exploration with healthy skepticism, a rigorous verification. These are huge questions we need to address.
So it really feels like this whole field is at a fascinating intersection, hard science meeting subjective experience, challenging our fundamental ideas.
It truly is. It's controversial, there are many mysteries, many debates, but the tools we have now, from neuroscience and other fields, allow us to probe these questions with more rigor than ever before.
And it raises that profound possibility. Maybe extrasensory isn't supernatural at all. Maybe it's just natural potential we haven't fully understood or developed yet.
Exactly. Extraordinary, perhaps, but part of the natural order, governed by laws we're still uncovering. It requires that careful, balanced, critical thinking, alongside genuine open-mindedness.
So a final thought perhaps for our listeners to ponder. What if reality is more interconnected than we usually assume? What if the edges of our own consciousness are more permeable, more fluid?
It invites us to consider our own potential, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And to stay curious about the deep mysteries that still lie right at the edge of what we know.
A fascinating place to explore. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today.